Well, hi, it's Mr. Kingsbury, and I'm back one more time with one more skill. I've done a couple of videos already where we talked about regressing equations and solving quadratic systems in the calculator. The last thing I want to do is show you how to solve a quadratic system by hand, that is to say, algebraically. We're going to use the quadratic formula, so that's going to pop up here in a second, but I wanted to walk you through the process just in case you needed a refresher. So the first thing we have to remember is that when we're solving a system, what we're actually finding are the intersections of two different graphs, or where two equations are equal. Now I have this problem here, and it may look familiar because this is the same problem I did in a previous video. It talks about the height that a baseball is at a given time after it's tossed in the air, and it talks about this gentleman named Jonathan who's going to shoot the baseball with a paintball gun. The trajectory of the paintball is given by this equation. The trajectory of the baseball is given by that equation. And what we're going to do is solve this by hand. So as I was mentioning, when you're solving a system, you are finding, graphically speaking, the intersection of two graphs. Algebraically speaking, you are finding where the two graphs are equal. So the first thing we need to do is take this equation, negative 3t squared plus 8t plus 5, and set it equal to this equation, 2.5t plus 1. That's step one. Now that we've done that, then we can proceed towards solving this. And we're going to solve it with the quadratic formula, because the quadratic formula works no matter what you're given. It will even tell you if there are real solutions versus complex solutions and so forth. In order to use the quadratic formula, our quadratic equation must be equal to 0. So I need to move this stuff on the right over to the left. To do that, first I'm going to subtract 2.5t. I will do that from both sides. So on the left side here, 8t minus 2.5t is 5.5t. That's a positive 5.5t. I still have a plus 5, and I still have a negative 3t squared, so I will copy those. And I'll put my equal sign. On the right side, the 2.5t and the negative 2.5t, or if you will, 2.5t minus 2.5t is 0. That cancels out, and it leaves me with just a 1. Then I'm going to subtract that 1 from both sides. Whoa. I did not intend to put that much lead out into the world. There we go. So on the right here, this cancels out, and I'm left with 0. On the left, 5 minus 1 is 4. And then I still have negative 3t squared plus 5.5t. Now I have a quadratic equation that is equal to 0, and I can solve this using the quadratic formula. Here we go. So to use the quadratic formula, I break things down a lot. Most mathematicians will pull the a, the b, and the c out of the quadratic equation, and then they'll plug those into the quadratic formula and go from there. I'm going to take it a step further. I found that the quadratic formula can be overwhelming, and I find that if I do a bunch of the calculations, little calculations, independently, then I can use them to make my formula a little bit easier to bear. So I'm going to start with a, just like most mathematicians, and that's going to be negative 3. Then I'm going to figure out what 2 times a is. So a times 2 is 2a, and if I multiply this side by 2, I need to multiply this side by 2. Negative 3 times 2 is negative 6. Then I'm going to find b. In this case, b is 5.5. And then I also want to find b squared. And please, when you do b squared, I don't care if it's positive or negative, but please, when you type it in the calculator, put parentheses around it and the square outside. If it's a positive number, it doesn't make that much of a difference. But with a negative number, it is night and day. If you don't put the parentheses and it's a negative number, you will get a negative square, which is impossible. So please don't do that. 5.5 squared happens to be 30.25. My c value is going to be here. That's my constant, 4. And then I'm going to find what 4 times a times c is. I'm not entirely sure, so I'm going to go to my calculator here. I know I got 4 times a is negative 3 times c is 4. I get negative 48. So that's good. And I'm going to scoot this over just a little bit so I have a little more room to write. Then I'm going to find the discriminant. Remember, the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. My b squared is 30.25 minus my 4ac, which I calculated to be negative 48. So I'm going to put negative 48. Now, some of you are going to look at this and go, Kingsbury, there are two negatives there. Is that correct? Yes, it is. This is the minus from the formula. This is the negative from the 4ac value that I calculated. So they both need to be here. Don't assume one and the other are the same. I've got people that will do that. They'll only put one negative here. They'll get a negative number that they will later try and take the square root of. It won't work, and then they wonder why life is horrible, and don't do that. They need to be here. And in fact, the two negatives cancel out and just make it one big positive. 30.25 plus 48 is 78.25. So that's my discriminant value. I'm not going to interpret it, although I'll just verbally point out it's a positive number. So that means there's two real solutions, which is great. Now we will actually use the quadratic formula, which is x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now you can see what I mean about that being overwhelming. That's a lot. But I think using this method, we can narrow some things down. So, and I haven't crossed stuff off, but technically I've already used b squared and 4ac. I technically used a and c when I calculated 4ac. So all that's left is 2a and b squared minus 4ac, which I have. And watch, I'm going to use those right now. So b is 5.5. The opposite of that would be negative 5.5. And then we have plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Well, we know what b squared minus 4ac is. We calculated it to be 78.25. And that's all over 2a, which we calculated to be negative 6. So look, we've used all of the pieces, which is great. Now, if this was a perfect square under the square root sign here, I would go ahead and do one more step and I'd square root it, but it's not. So I'm just going to leave it there. Instead, I'm going to go to my calculator and type this in. I do want to caution you. We're going to have to type it in twice and see what our answers are. My caution is this. A lot of times people will type this in. They'll type the whole thing in, and they'll do it wrong. Here's what I mean. What I want to type is negative 5.5 plus the square root of 78.25 divided by negative 6. This is how many people will type it in. I'm sorry, you can't see what I've done. This is how many people will type it in, and it's wrong. According to PEMDAS, you would do the division first, and then you would do the addition, which is not what we want. We want the addition first. So if you're going to type it all the way in like this, you need to put parentheses on either end. If you're not sure how to do that, I can tell you. You might be able to figure it out online, whatever. But you've got to tell the calculator to do that first. Honestly, I like to just do the top first. So I'm going to type negative 5.5 plus the square root of 7.25. And I'm going to hit enter. It gives me control, and I've just told the calculator what it's going to do. Then I'm going to hit divided by negative 6. And I get negative 0.56 approximately. Here's my problem. I can't have negative time, and that's what I just solved for. X is time. I can't have negative time. That's no good. Okay, I guess technically it's t, but it's all the same thing. So this is not going to be a feasible answer. It's not realistic because it's negative time. So let's try the other one. Negative 5.5 minus the square root of 78.25. I'm going to hit enter, and then I will divide by negative 6, and I get positive 2.39. So x is going to be 2.39 seconds. That's how you do that by hand. Hopefully that broke it down enough for you to understand everything. If you got any questions, feel free to let me know, and I will see you in class.